Mrs. Brandon's husband was an airfield technician, and when their beloved son Clark had turned 5, he died tragically in the line of duty. It was a heavy blow for the young woman. Her parents lived far away, and her husband was an orphan, so after the death of her husband, Mrs. Brandon raised her son alone, not hoping for anyone's help. When Clark turned 18, he went into the army. Mrs. Brandon lost peace and sleep waiting for letters from him. She used to reread each letter several times, and every time the mother's heart clenched with love and anxiety for her son. In his letters, Clark usually wrote that he was doing well. He comforted his mother, understanding how hard it was for her to be away from him, and reminded her that he would be home soon. Mrs. Brandon lived in a large house, which she had bought with her husband. All the paperwork, including the men's work, the woman had long ago been accustomed to doing by herself. During the summer, she mowed the lawn by herself, and in winter she cleaned the snow. Her neighbour, Mrs. Bentham, repeatedly offered to help her, but she always refused. "Mrs. Brandon, you'd better do women's things. Let me help," he used to shout to her in the mornings, when the woman took a shovel to clear away the snow which had piled up during the night. "No, Mr. Bentham, I'd rather do it myself. Otherwise, I'd get used to someone helping me and then relax, but I do not need it now." It was impossible to change Mrs. Brandon's mind. The neighbour had known her for many years and knew that she would never accept his help. Finally, Clark came home. Mrs. Brandon was crying with happiness and could not get enough of her grown-up son. She set a festive table, and after the dinner she made a bed for her son. Mrs. Brandon stood by him for a long time watching him sleep, and it was impossible to express the happiness of a mother who had once again reunited with her beloved son. Though he had changed, matured greatly, but to her he would always remain a little boy. Soon a new life began. Clark went to college, and in the evenings he worked part-time to take care of his mother, who by that time had already retired. One day, Clark announced that he would like to introduce her to his girlfriend. Mrs. Brandon was very excited because she had been hinting for a long time that it was time for him to end his single life and find someone for the family life. When Clark's girlfriend entered the house, Mrs. Brandon immediately noticed how beautiful she was. Peggy politely said hello and gave Mrs. Brandon a hand with a nice manicure. All the evening, the elderly woman did not take her eyes off her future daughter-in-law. She was surprised at how beautiful and well-mannered she was, but most importantly, she saw that Peggy loved her son, and that was the most important thing for her. From that day on, Peggy started to appear at Mrs. Brandon's house frequently. At first, the woman was really pleased with her son's fiancé, but she soon began to notice that the girl's character was not as good as her looks. Several times she heard Peggy complaining about her and saying that she was picking on her and demanding the impossible. However, none of that was true. Unfortunately, the son believed his fiancée and constantly fought with his mother. Soon Clark and Peggy were married, and after the wedding they moved to the city, to a rented apartment, visiting Mrs. Brandon only on weekends. Such a life in general suited Mrs. Brandon, because her relationship with her daughter-in-law was tense. Thus 5 years have passed, and then one day disaster came to Mrs. Brandon's house. Clark died in a car accident on his way to his mother while he was delivering medicine for her. This tragedy put Mrs. Brandon even more at odds with her daughter-in-law. The young woman blamed her mother-in-law for her husband's death, without thinking at all about how hard it was for her to lose her only son. The women blamed each other, and life became a real nightmare for both of them. and a couple of months after Clark's death, Peggy showed up on Mrs. Brandon's doorstep. Since her husband had a share in that house, and the girl inherited it after his death, she decided to use her right and stay here. From that moment on, hard times came into the elderly woman's life. Quarrels with her daughter-in-law occurred almost daily, usually over trifles, and most often the initiator was Peggy. Mrs. Brandon was sad to see how quickly she recovered from her husband's passing, and how she began to dress up and go out in the evenings. One day she asked where Peggy was going to, and her daughter-in-law's reaction shocked her. "Do you think I should be in mourning all my life now?" "Well, your son is gone. So what? I want to move on with my life." "But it's only been 3 months. How can you live like this?" Horrified Mrs. Brandon. "Stop reminding me of that," said Peggy, and left, leaving the elderly woman alone with her thoughts. Mrs. Brandon was hurt that her daughter-in-law had forgotten her son so quickly. She had never even been to his grave, while Mrs. Brandon spent all her spare time there. She usually talked to her son, telling him how difficult it was for her to live with his wife, who finally showed her true face. Mrs. Brandon, of course, disliked Peggy's behaviour, but what made her most furious was a conversation she had with her late one evening. "Mrs. Brandon, why don't you sell me part of the house? You won't need it any time soon. You could move into a nursing home or hospice, and I could have a separate place to live," said Peggy, looking at the elderly woman defiantly. "What? Peggy, are you out of your mind? This is my house. We bought it together with my husband, and you want to take it away?" said Mrs. Brandon, with pain in her voice. "Not to take away, but to buy. Please try to understand. I have a lot of time to live, and your days are over. So why ruin each other's lives? So it's better to agree amicably," said Peggy, and in her voice sounded a barely concealed threat. But Mrs. Brandon could not be frightened so easily. She was not going to sell her share, and no one had the right to tell her what to do in her own home. After that conversation, Mrs. Brandon was really mad at Peggy. She didn't want to see her in the house any more, and even contacted her parents to convince them to take their daughter in. But the conversation didn't work out. As it turned out, it was they who advised her to claim her rights to her former mother-in-law's house and sent her there to live. Every day the life of the elderly woman was getting worse. One morning Mrs. Brandon went out to the kitchen and bumped into a man without clothes coming out of Peggy's bedroom. Mrs. Brandon shouted and pushed the stranger out into the street, and when Peggy woke up, there was a huge scandal, which the neighbours had never heard before. "Who are you to kick my man out of my house? Have you completely lost your fear?" squealed Peggy. "Well, that's it. I'll do my best to throw you out of here soon." "What are you saying? We'll see about that," sharply replied Mrs. Brandon. "This is my house, and nobody will take it away from me." From that moment on, different men started coming into the house, and Peggy tried with all her might to get her ex-mother-in-law out of the house. It all ended one night when the elderly woman had a severe heart attack and was taken to the hospital. The treatment lasted long, but Mrs. Brandon was in no hurry to go home, because in the quietness of her hospital room she could rest for the first time. Mr. Bentham often came to visit her, keeping her informed, and one day he said that Peggy sold her share of the house and went to another city with her parents. Learning about this, Mrs. Brandon became sad and afraid because she did not know what kind of people would now live with her under one roof. A month later, Mrs. Brandon was discharged from the hospital, and on her way to the house, she felt her heart painfully clenched. She went to the door and tried to open it, but quickly realized that the lock had been changed. Mrs. Brandon sat down on the bench and cried. It was winter outside. It was snowing, and when a young couple finally approached the house, Mrs. Brandon was already completely covered with snow. Those were the people who had bought a share of the house. They noticed the woman and asked if she needed anything. "Oh, I live here," Mrs. Brandon said, sobbing. "My former daughter-in-law changed the locks, and I can't get home." "No, we're the ones who changed them. We bought Peggy's share and changed the locks because of her. She kept taking things out of the house, even after the sale. So it turns out we're your neighbours." The young woman smiled. She let the elderly woman into the house, and Mrs. Brandon saw that everything inside was the same, except that many things were missing. The lock in her room was broken, and the TV had disappeared. The woman sat down on her bed and began to think about what she should do now. Realizing that she had no way out, she decided to leave everything as it was and move on with her life. Fortunately, the life with her new neighbours was very different from what it was with Peggy. They were good people who took care of all the household chores and took care of the elderly woman in a way that made her a little embarrassed sometimes. Sonia was a good cook and fed Mrs. Brandon a delicious meal, while Lionel never let her do any of the heavy housework and did everything himself. They became good friends, and Mrs. Brandon could no longer imagine her life without this couple. One day, she and Sonia were making dumplings together and got to talking. It turned out that Peggy and Sonia used to be good friends. Peggy, according to Sonia, was very different back then and had changed only recently. One day, she called and told about the share in the house. Sonia and Lionel didn't have the money for a separate place, and they agreed. "Oh, I can imagine what she said about me," grinned Mrs. Brandon. "You know, I also liked her at first, and I thought Peggy loved my son, but it didn't turn out that way." The women talked for a long time, telling each other their own stories. Sonia shared her memories of a difficult childhood without parents, and Mrs. Brandon was shaking her head sympathetically. When Lionel came and they all sat down for dinner, Mrs. Brandon realized that she hadn't felt so good in a very long time. It was that evening she firmly decided to bequeath her part of the house to these wonderful people who had become almost family to her. She made all the paperwork at the notary, but did not tell Sonia and Lionel about it. They lived together very amicably until Mrs. Brandon's last day, and after her death, a pleasant surprise awaited the young people. The whole house was theirs now. They were very surprised and grateful. A year later, they had a daughter, whom they did not hesitate to name after Mrs. Brandon. Before she died, Mrs. Brandon told Sonia that all her life she had dreamed of having a daughter like her, and at the end of her life, her dream came true. She went to another world as a happy person, surrounded by the love of caring and unselfish people.